Hello and welcome back to the News Project. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. It's also a great pleasure to be joined by Dr. Edward Cameron, who is a resident of Manchester and a widely recognized expert and consultant on climate change issues and the global economy that might be built around climate change and climate resiliency. Following an international career working with the European Union and other international organizations, he is currently a senior advisor to companies, philanthropies, governments, and global nonprofits. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Cameron to our virtual studio today. So, Ed, welcome back again to the News Project. Great to see you again. It was a couple of months ago, I think we had you down at our studio for a genuine old-fashioned discussion there, and hopefully the opportunity to do that will come soon again. But in the meantime, it's great to have you in our virtual studio and here to talk a little bit about your new book that just came out, A World Made New, Beyond COVID-19 to a Low-Carbon, Resilient, and Inclusive World. So we want to talk a little bit about that and kind of what the pandemic implies for the world economy and climate change going forward. It certainly is a moment that may present both opportunities as well as risks. But I just thought to kind of get us started, I found myself thinking after we scheduled this interview about a memory I had from towards the early days of the pandemic, second half of March or so, when I recall reading about how the pollution levels in places that normally do suffer from a lot of air pollution was a lot less, that the amount of economic activity had diminished so much that within the space of just a couple of weeks, residents of places like New Delhi and Beijing in China were seeing blue skies, which I guess is somewhat unusual for them. Does that suggest that if the world were to get its act together and actually get serious about climate change and cleaning up carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, we would see that kind of improvement that quickly, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, first, Andrew, it's lovely to be with you again, and that visit does seem like a different age, not just a number of months ago. But I'm delighted to join you virtually. In terms of the question, I think that we have to sometimes make a distinction between pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. Often, of course, they're the same things, but what you saw in places like Beijing and New Delhi was a lifting of the smog that blankets those cities and other cities in that region daily because of the level of not just greenhouse gas emissions, but other types of pollutants. The problem is that greenhouse gas emissions, as you know, have a long lifespan, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries. And so it's not just a question of how many pollutants we put into the atmosphere today or even this year. It's the accumulation of greenhouse gases over decades, centuries, and even millennia. So yes, we need urgent action, but even if we take urgent action, we won't begin to see the net benefit of all of that for some considerable time. Now, of course, we would see a reduction in smog, as we did see, but the actual effect on the global climate system takes far longer than that. The second thing that I would say is, of course, that we don't seek to save the climate by destroying the economy. And I often found it to be troubling to hear people celebrating the reduction of emissions through the destruction of the global economy, because what we actually need is what's called a just transition to a low carbon, resilient and inclusive future, one where livelihoods are preserved and indeed improved, one where economic development is catalyzed, one where we replace a high carbon economy with a low carbon economy, but continue to focus on wealth creation, job creation, and the development of societies all around the globe. So I personally don't celebrate a situation where we see GDP falling at a rate unprecedented since the Great Depression. I don't celebrate a situation where we see unemployment levels growing to unprecedented scale. I would personally prefer to see a situation where we are able to protect people's livelihoods, provide them with a pathway to prosperity, but do so in a way that protects our planetary systems. And that is possible but that is certainly not what we saw in those days and weeks when COVID emerged.
Mm. Do you think the COVID-19 emergency is some sort of a preview of what might happen if there were a real 9/11 style climate change emergency? I mean, the kind of disruption we're seeing in economics, in public health, is that the sort of thing we might anticipate seeing should worst comes to worst in the climate field?
I wouldn't call it a preview so much as a parallel. And I wouldn't say that it's something that we could expect. I would actually argue it's something we were already experiencing. So the first thing to say about COVID, of course, is that it's a tragic public health emergency. We see, of course, the number of confirmed cases rising on a daily basis, the number of hospitalizations, and unfortunately, the number of deaths. But prior to COVID, it's important to remember that we had 9 million premature deaths from air pollution every single year. We had 820 million people around the world who are undernourished and suffering all of the different types of illnesses that are a consequence of a lack of food security. We saw 22,000 children dying every day of hunger. We have seen over the course of recent decades between 60 and 100 million disappeared women around the world for all manner of reasons related to structural discrimination. So there was already a public health emergency. It was simply one that we chose to ignore. Second of all, we're of course experiencing an economic crisis. We're seeing, according to the Bank of England, GDP fall that's unprecedented since 1706. We're seeing a collapse in foreign direct investment in developing countries. We're seeing global multinational companies failing to pay their bills into their supply chains in emerging economies and developing countries around the world. And of course, we're seeing rapid rises in unemployment. But again, prior to COVID, we had experienced approximately $300 billion of annual losses as a consequence of climate impacts and extremes. Now that's an interesting number because that parallels almost exactly the amount of money that's been mobilized in the CARES Act for the Small Business Resuscitation Plan. We were experiencing that level of loss annually in the United States alone, and the Financial Stability Board was estimating losses of in the region of $40 trillion by the end of this century as a consequence of climate change. We also, of course, know what inequality was doing to the United States. I can recall vividly the government shutdown of 2019 when a statistic came out that suggested that 40% of Americans could not accommodate a $400 emergency expense. And that resonated with me because the day that statistic came out, I was actually in the pharmacy buying medication that cost $400 for my 2 young sons. And the thought occurred to me, what would I do if I were one of these people that could not afford this emergency expense? So we already had an economic crisis. The third parallel is, of course, that both COVID and climate disproportionately impact the most vulnerable and marginalized in society. So you see, for example, the disproportionate impacts on low-income populations, on people of color, and of course on developing countries who lack access to healthcare systems from COVID. But you equally saw disproportionate impacts of climate change on women, low-income groups, marginalized communities who suffer from human rights abuses, and of course people of color all around the world. And then I would say a fourth and fifth parallel that occurred to me, which I think are important, is first of all, with both climate and COVID, we have failed to properly diagnose the risk. We have been complacent. With COVID, we were complacent about the risks of encroaching on nature. We were complacent about the risks that a globalized world and the amount of travel that exists in that globalized world, what that means for our populations. We were complacent with our investments in our healthcare systems. But equally, when it comes to climate change, we have been complacent in terms of our failure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and our failure to build societal resilience. And then the fifth and final parallel, which I find particularly troubling in the context of the United States, is our ability to turn this issue, COVID, into a culture war issue, just as we managed to turn climate change into a culture war issue. You used to see a scenario whereby people on the right of the political spectrum in the United States would deny climate science, and now you see those very same people denying COVID science. You see those very same people suggesting that wearing a mask is an encroachment on their personal liberty, just as they suggested that reducing fossil fuel emissions was an encroachment on their personal liberty. So that encroachment of the culture wars into what ought to be simply a matter of science and public policy is very troubling to me, particularly in the context of the United States.
Yeah, indeed, it is very troubling to see that kind of division going on and persisting, even despite all the evidence that has been mounting over these past 3 or 4 months. But let's pivot a little bit here to what's in your new book here that's available, I believe, at the Northshire Bookstore. If folks want to pick up a copy. You discuss many things in it. Part of it, what needs to change economically as we come out of the pandemic. In other words, how will we rebuild the world economic order? Is the goal simply to just recreate the economy of December 2019, or do we attempt to see this as an opportunity to restructure some things? So what would, in your opinion, the new world order, for lack of a better phrase, look like as we hopefully eventually successfully emerge out of the pandemic era?
Well, when I decided to write the book, I actually wrote it within a 3-week period. And the first reason I decided to write it is because I personally wanted to understand the world as it was changing around me. I was seeing all manner of articles that would deal with one or two elements of the unfolding crisis, but I didn't really see anything that brought all of it together in one place: the economic crisis, the public health emergency, the disproportionate impacts, the effect on supply chains, the effect on food systems, and so on and so forth. So my first motivation was really to help understand the world. My second motivation arrived quite quickly, and that was the alarm I felt when I saw politicians of all stripes using terms like restart, resuscitate, as a euphemism for recreating the economy as it existed in December 2019. And as I just mentioned in my previous comments, my feeling, having worked at the interface between development, climate, and human rights for over 2 decades, was the economy of December 2019 was failing us. So if we simply returned to an economy that had economic crisis, environmental degradation, and rampant inequality, all of the suffering, all of the difficulties of this moment would have been in vain. So that brought me to the third motivation, which is, what ought we do differently, and what should different look like going forward? And for me personally, there are 3 components to what a world made new needs to have. First of all, it needs to be low carbon. We need to now be on a trajectory to achieve what's called net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That requires 45% emissions reductions by the end of this decade. And that means we have to rapidly and dramatically rethink our energy systems, our food systems, and our transportation primarily, and reduce emissions from those sectors. The second thing is we need to build resilient societies. We see, of course, that we are vulnerable to all manner of different threats as a consequence of COVID. We need to build resilience, and resilience means we need to increase our own capacity to anticipate risks, to avoid those risks where possible, to accommodate them where necessary, but ultimately to be able to recover from them and bounce back. And that's something that our society and our ecosystems, unfortunately, currently lack. And then the third issue is we need to build an inclusive world. And that means sharing prosperity, but it also means building an inclusive politics. Because one of the things we see in COVID and we see in climate is this fact that structural discrimination, whether political, cultural, social, economic, or legal, dramatically amplifies risk for the marginalized right across the world. So if we only change the chemical composition of our atmosphere over the coming decade, but do nothing to address food insecurity, do nothing to address poverty, do nothing to address a lack of social mobility, then we will have spent trillions of dollars in vain. Now, with the book, what I really wanted to do was to turn those 3 strategic ideas into very specific tactical recommendations. And so the book contains 15 different specific recommendations for how we should use this moment, and specifically how we should think about the stimulus packages that are now going to think of the economy anew, I hope. And so I've put those recommendations out there, not with any claim that they're the correct recommendations, but really with a humble attempt to start a conversation. And the reason for that is because most people in my community, most people in climate world, have spent, I think, far too long thinking of climate change as an environmental problem with an environmental solution. And in a sense, this book is a call for us all to get out of our lanes and to start thinking much more in terms of systems. not only think of an environment or an energy policy, but think about the fact that we need serious changes to our fiscal policies if we're to create a better world.
Do you get any sense that political leaders in major and minor countries have that notion in their minds that, hey, we can't just rebuild the economy as it was 6 months ago, but we need to do almost take advantage of what in some ways might be thought of as an opportunity to restructure things in a more positive direction where, let's say, things like wealth distribution is a little bit more equal, or transportation is more eco-friendly, or is it going to be the case you feel, because the pessimistic side of me goes, well, yeah, that sounds great, but politicians will probably want to get people back to work first, and then we'll worry about the environmental niceties later, like we've been doing for the past 10 or 20 years?
Well, the first thing to say, it's not an either or, and it's not a first and then second. Remember, of course, that renewable energy jobs are growing at a rate in the United States 12 times faster than the rest of the economy, or at least they were before COVID. And the number of people involved and employed in renewable energies far outstrips, of course, the number of people employed in the fossil fuel industry. So it shouldn't be seen as, let's first take care of jobs and then let's take care of these other nice to haves. It really should be done holistically and in concert. The direct answer to your question is, of course, that it's a mixed bag. In some parts of the world and in some parts of the United States, there is not only an openness to think about this much more strategically, but there is actually action to back it up. So if you look at the European Union, for example, they've come up with something called the EU Green Deal, and it's extremely comprehensive. It mobilizes vast amounts of money in support of this recovery, and it does it in a way, I think, that is sensible from an economic standpoint, but also, of course, ambitious from a climate standpoint as well. This situation in the United States, of course, is very different. You have pockets of leadership and action at the state level. You obviously, of course, have at the federal level an awful lot of foot dragging on this, not because the money is unavailable to us, but because, of course, there's some ideological baggage that prevents the current administration, I think, from investing this money well. Too much of the stimulus that's been mobilized up until this point in the US has unfortunately been spent propping up the high carbon economy, propping up the fossil fuel industries in particular, propping up big agriculture, which is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions too. The important message, I think, though, to my colleagues across the environmental community is, over the course of the coming year, we'll probably spend collectively about $10 trillion, if not more, on economic recovery. That money is not coming back to us anytime soon. That's not money that you're going to secretly find another stash of under the couch a year from now. That's probably expenditure that's going to last a generation. So if we don't spend this money well now, if we spend this money poorly now, we have probably lost the opportunity to get to net zero by 2050. So there is an opportunity, but there's also a huge urgency now to focus on this above all else, to get this right. Because if we get this right, the rewards will be significant. If we get this wrong, the chance to roll it back may be lost to us.
What do you think is the role of the financial community in this? I've been reading a couple of articles lately about green financing and hedge funds and Wall Street operations that want to de-invest from fossil fuel industries and get into solar and wind industries and that sort of thing. But a lot of it seems to indicate to me that the financial aspect of this is more of a follower than a leader. Do you get the sense that this is a chicken and egg kind of situation, or that really if some major hedge fund that controls billions of dollars were to say to, let's say, Exxon or one of the other fossil fuel giants, hey, you guys really need to get out of oil exploration and start figuring out how to make the world's cheapest solar panels, would that make a difference?
Oh, a huge difference. I would argue that public policy, of course, is critical in terms of, for example, setting economy-wide emissions reduction standards and putting in place fuel efficiency standards and so on. All of that is vital. But ultimately, what we've got to do is to change the direction of a $90 trillion global economy. And you can't do that without tackling the financial services sector, and you can't do it without tackling the financial components of public policy. Now, they do go hand in hand because, of course, right now, approximately 6% of global GDP is spent annually on perverse subsidies to make fossil fuels artificially cheap. So, of course, when you have that public policy in place, then the financial services sector responds by investing its money in the fossil fuel industry and in other high carbon sectors. So, first and foremost, I think we need to change the signals that public policy sends to the financial services sector in order to de-risk low carbon investments, in order to increase the profitability of low carbon investments, in order to increase the risk of fossil fuels. You mentioned stranded assets, for example, but also in terms of reducing the profitability of fossil fuels. So that linkage between the public and private is really important. Now, we already do see strides in that direction. I think it was laudable last year that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, I believe it's the largest wealth and asset manager in the world. I believe they're worth somewhere in the region of $7 trillion. And they came out and said that going forward, sustainability criteria were going to be key to their investments and their decision making, that they would begin to withdraw from fossil fuel investments. They would gradually scale up their investments in low carbon portfolios, and that they would also use their voting power on the boards of major corporations to vote out C-suites that were not in favor of sustainability. So I think that's a very important signal. I hope that it's backed up with real action, and I hope that it's mirrored and followed by other large companies out there, whether it's Vanguard, for example, or some of the major banks. Interestingly, some of the companies that have taken significant climate change commitments are actually in the financial services sector. And they've taken commitments, for example, to purchase all of their energy from renewable sources. But they haven't backed that commitment with changes to their own investment portfolios. So I think one of the things that we can do is put far more pressure on the financial services sector to be consistent in their ambition, and to not only have commitments of their own, but actually to make sure that their entire portfolio is consistent with a low carbon future.
Mm. Meanwhile, getting a little more local, how are we doing on all this in Vermont? I mean, we have some fairly ambitious environmental goals in place. So by 2050, we want to have 90% of all of our energy's use be non-renewable. But every time I check on that, it just sounds like progress has been very halting and slow, and trying to get from here to there in the next 30 years is going to be, at the rate we're going, impossible. Any signs that that's beginning to turn around in the right direction, or what have you been hearing?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that there is in Montpelier a very substantial climate caucus that I think does have the right sorts of ambition, the right sorts of ideas, the right commitment to this topic. Obviously, the Global Warming Solutions Act that was passed is important as a first step, because it does mean that commitments that Vermont takes as a state are legally binding, and it provides an opportunity for citizens of Vermont to hold the state government accountable if those targets are not met. So I think that's very important in terms of the provision of accountability. It's very important as a signal that the state is serious about these issues, but it's equally important that that first step is backed up by subsequent steps. We still don't have enough policies dealing with energy, dealing with agriculture, dealing with transportation that actually gives a chance for that target to be met. And there certainly isn't anywhere near the level of investment or divestment. So there isn't enough of a concentration on the finances of all of this at the state level for my liking just yet. The other thing that I would say is it's really, really important for Vermont to do this, but it's equally important for Vermont to realize that it accounts for 0.1% of 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the things that Vermont can achieve within Vermont are quite modest. The things that Vermont can achieve, however, by other means are quite significant. So I've often said, for example, that Vermont was one of the co-litigants in Massachusetts versus EPA from 2007, which is the Supreme Court case that gave executive authority to the president so that he, up until now, has the opportunity to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollution under the Clean Air Act. That's an extremely important piece of leadership that Vermont took many years ago. Equally important is the fact that Vermont has stated that it will join California in their emissions reduction standards for vehicles. So there's lots of things that Vermont can do that will amplify the power that Vermont has to tackle this particular problem. It's not just about spending and policy within the state. It's about thinking through all of the various levers available to policymakers here, all of the various levers available to us as citizens, and actually using them to their full potential. And I don't think we've done that yet.
Mm. We have a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to kind of follow up on a point you made earlier about how folks in the environmental community need to kind of get out of their lanes or get out of silos. Is that a process you think that's going to be quick, easy, or are there some structural problems here that are going to keep folks from separating the two things you were mentioning there, the economics and the environmental sides?
I think there are structural problems. I think, for example, that many of the philanthropies that support the environmental movement have a very specific theory of change. Sometimes what they want is advocacy that is specifically aimed at energy, for example, or sometimes they want to fund grassroots organizations for a protest down State Street in Montpelier. And as a consequence of the way in which philanthropies offer money into our community, quite often organizations within the community tend to stay in their comfort zone. And they tend to do what they've always done rather than embracing something that is a little bit more innovative and perhaps a little bit more systems thinking. In addition, when I was writing this book, I was asking colleagues and friends of mine in the media about whether I should write this book or not. And a lot of the responses were, well, we don't want to hear a climate guy talking about fiscal policy. If we want to hear you talk, we want to hear you talking about environment and energy. So even I, writing this book, was getting an awful lot of pushback from friends and colleagues that were essentially telling me, stay in your own lane and don't broach out from beyond it. Then, of course, there's a mentality problem. I think that, over the years, we've become comfortable arguing for certain types of policies. And it's a shift of mentality and perspective to start arguing for other things. In my book, for example, I give equal space to inheritance and wealth tax as I give to carbon pricing. And that's not something that's comfortable, because in order to write about those things, I had to go out and educate myself on those things. And that's difficult. So I think there are structural things, but I think a lot of it is also related to mentality. And of course, some of it is to do with the fact that this is a problem that's evolving, and the solution itself and our understanding of solutions are evolving too. And so perhaps it's natural that we're a little bit behind the curve. Perhaps it's natural that we're slow in our response to the opportunity of COVID, because on the 31st of December 2019, we did not know that this was coming. My hope is, however, that increasingly we become more and more agile and capable of moving quickly on these issues, because the window of opportunity to shape these stimulus packages is extremely narrow. And as I said earlier, we maybe have 6 months to get this right. If we do, it'll be transformative. If we don't, it will be problematic, to say the least.
Wow. I guess we're going to have to leave it there for now, Ed. So the book is called The World Made New, Beyond COVID-19 to a Low Carbon, Resilient and Inclusive World. And you can get it at the Northshire Bookstore, I believe.
You can indeed, yes.
And probably many other places as well. Ed, thank you very much again for your time. Really appreciate it. Always a pleasure to talk with you. And we'll see you again soon.